In Old English, they didn't have the word pleasure, which is a word borrowed from French, plaisir. Instead, they might say Lif-wynn, literally a life win. Today on Let Them Talk TV, we're looking at the difference between Old English, Middle English and Modern English and the epoch-defining events that caused these changes. It's English, but not as you know it. Stick around because it'll be a Lif-wynn for you. If you're ready, then let us go. That's let's go in Middle English, by the way.
Hwatwe jar denum en jar dagum, theud kuninga, thrimje frunan, hutha athalingus ellen fremidon.
The period of Old English, also called Anglo-Saxon, lasted from the mid-5th century until around 1150, when linguists say that the Middle English period began. Of course, it wasn't just a switcheroo in one day from Old English to Middle English. It was a gradual evolution in the decades following the Norman conquests of 1066. This graphic shows the tribes who migrated to England mainly after the Romans withdrew from England in 410 AD. The main tribes were the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. The Angles settled mostly in the northern and eastern regions, and their dialect became known as Anglian. The Jutes established themselves primarily in the southeast, while the Saxons settled in the southern and western areas. The Anglian dialect can be further divided into Mercian, spoken between the Thames and the Humber rivers, and Northumbrian, spoken to the north of the Humber. Side note here, the part of the Northumbrian dialect in Scotland got split off from the part in England and it evolved into the Scots language. That's a subject for another video. The Jutes dialect became known as Kentish. It was spoken in Kent. And then in the West, you have West Saxon. The Old English period spanned 700 years. That's the equivalent of going back from today to 1325. So Old English covered many dialects across many centuries. While there is some writing stretching back to the 7th century, and there is some Mercian writings from the latter periods, but most of the writing that survives, most of what we know about Old English comes from the West Saxon, and this is due in large part to leaders of the era, notably King Alfred the Great, who encouraged learning and, crucially, the writing of English at a time when English was under threat from the Vikings who ruled over most of England. Of the Old English that survives, the majority of it is from the West Saxon dialect in the period 900 to 1100. In fact, from the Old English period, there is actually more writing that survives from Latin than Old English. But we're lucky, thanks in large part to Alfred the Great, that quite a lot of vernacular writing of that period survives too. In many other parts of Europe, such as France, Italy and Spain, they weren't so lucky. In France, for example, very few texts from before the 11th century in French have survived. The ones that have survived are almost exclusively in Latin. Now, when I say a lot of Old English survives, it's all relative. According to David Crystal, if all the Old English that we have were compiled in a bookcase, they would come to about 30 medium-sized novels. So everything we have from Old English would easily fit on one bookshelf in your living room. The most famous piece of writing from the Old English period is Beowulf. It was written down in the 10th century, but it was probably created several centuries earlier and passed down orally through the ages until a scribe compiled it into a manuscript many centuries later. Actually, we're lucky we have it at all. For many centuries, there was only one copy, and that was almost destroyed in a fire. Let me read you the newspaper clip from the time. A fire broke out in the house of Mr. Bentley, adjoining to the King's School near Westminster Abbey, which burnt down that part of the house that contained the King's and Cottonian libraries. Almost all the printed books were consumed, and part of the manuscripts. Fortunately, Beowulf survived with only minor singeing. By the way, I do recommend this excellent book about the story of Old English. It's called Wordhord by Hana, Videen, which was the source for much of my research on the Old English part of this video. I'll put a link in the description. That's the history. Let's look a little at the structure of Old English and how it differs from modern English. Modern English relies heavily on word order to express meaning, and that you build sentences with different types of words, verbs and nouns and adjectives that are glued together with prepositions and articles. It's usually subject, verb, object. So, the lady saw the man. I can't change the word order to the man saw the lady. That means something different. But in Old English, nouns, adjectives, and even articles had internal changes that carried grammatical information, which meant you could change words around. These are all the ways you can write the lady saw the man in Old English. In Old English, the word order can change for emphasis, rhythm, or poetic effect. It's the word endings that change. The Anglo-Saxons adopted the Latin alphabet in the 7th century, but they had 4 unique letters of their own that we don't use anymore. And they were thorn, a th in words like this and that, eth, another th sound, and thorn and eth were sometimes interchangeable, though not completely. Win for the W sound, ash for the ash sound in words like ash and cat. So sometimes an Old English word would be recognisable to us if we replace the Anglo-Saxon letter with a Latin letter. For example, can you read these? Well, the first one is thing. That's other. That's brother. That's apple. That's black. And that is we, and that is word. And of course, these are still words that we still use today, but they're just spelt differently. Old English had masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. Snow, for example, was masculine. The sun was feminine, and ship was neuter. That ship. It's more complicated because the adjective has to agree with the noun in gender, in both the singular and the plural. And then there is the genitive and the dative. And I'm not going to go into all that, but pause the video if you want to read one example. Making new words from old. If a language doesn't have a word or a concept, then it has 2 choices. It can borrow a word from another language, or it can create a compound word from its existing stock of words. Modern English has been more of a borrowing language. The source is usually Latin or French or sometimes Greek, but it can be from anywhere. Whereas German tends to make compound words. For example, in English we say umbrella, a word from Italian, whereas in German it's der Regenschirm, rain shield. In English, if you pay for something in cash, you might wait for your change, which is a word of French origin, while in German it's Kleingeld, little money. Now, English does have compound nouns too. So, for example, we say workshop and not atelier from French. We say playground and smartphone. And sometimes what we have in English is two words. One, an English compound, and also a borrowed word with the same or a similar meaning. So think of mankind and humanity, withstand and resist, outcome and result, and breakdown and collapse. In Old English, they did borrow words from other languages, notably Latin, but it was more of a feature to create compound nouns. Some have not survived or have changed over the centuries. So, for example, this word, yerush, spearush, which means battle. Wordhord, which is the title of this wonderful book I was just talking about, and that just means vocabulary. Fiend sickness is madness or insanity. And did you know that the English word lord comes from a compound Old English word, loaf-ward, the guardian of the bread. In other words, the master of the house. Kennings. These are kind of figurative expressions common in Old English poetry, and you can usually work out their meanings from the context. The Whale Road, that's the sea. The sky candle, that would be the sun, or perhaps the moon. Battle sweat, that's blood. Your bone house, yes, you got it. Your body. All was fine, but then in 1066, the Normans took the Whale Road to England, and there was a mighty spear rush under the sky candle at a place called Hastings. Not a Lif-wynn for the Anglo-Saxons and their King Harold. His bone house was covered in battle sweat.
With him there was his son, a young squire, a lover and lusty bachelor, with lockes cruel as they were laid in press. Of 20 years of age he was, I guess.
William the Conqueror and his Norman army were the victors, and for the next 350 years the language of power in England was French, or rather Anglo-Norman French. English was still the language of the peasants, but the nobility, the traders, the ruling class, they spoke French. Let's move our story forward now to 1400, well into the Middle English period. A few moments ago, I told you that there are very few written records in Anglo-Saxon between the 5th century and the end of the 9th century. Well, likewise, there are very few records written in English between 1066 and 1300, as most records, laws and proclamations in England at that time were written either in French or Latin. When we do pick up a piece of Middle English from Chaucer's time, it's around 1400, it's a totally different language from the one spoken in 1066. Gone are the grammatical genders, no more masculine, feminine and neuter nouns. Gone are most of the inflections. English now relies more on word order, and gone is much of the Old English vocabulary, or the Wordhord as they called it, replaced by words mainly from Anglo-Norman French. How did this happen? Firstly, Anglo-Saxon was already undergoing changes before the Norman invasions. As I said, the Anglo-Saxon period covers, 600 or 700 years and several dialects. And secondly, several centuries of that Anglo-Saxon period, the Vikings controlled much of England, and they spoke a language called Old Norse, which was also a Germanic language. So it's similar but not the same. In the Viking areas, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings lived side by side, trading, intermarrying and having bilingual speaking children. When you meet someone who speaks a language similar to yours but not the same, you may end up simplifying what you say to each other. And this almost certainly happens with Old English and Old Norse. That simplification was already underway before the Norman conquests. And it's estimated that 5% of English words come from Old Norse, by the way. And those include they, window, take, knife, sky, get, and that's just to name but a few. The other influence on English grammar was, of course, French. I talk more about it in this video here, so I'll just briefly give one example of many. And think of how often we use of constructions in English. These became widespread during the Middle English period, and it's possible it's from Normans speaking English but using French grammar, that is, translating word for word. De is of in French. So let me give you some examples. A tale of two cities, which can be translated word for word in French as un conte de deux villes. Not a two cities tale. At the crack of dawn. Not at dawn's crack. The end of the world, not the world's end. Although I have drunk in a pub in London called the World's End. So it does exist, but normally we say the end of the world, coming soon. Notice that in English, both forms are sometimes possible. So you could say the University of Oxford or Oxford University. In English, we do use the Saxon genitive, that's the apostrophe S for the possessive, as in the boy's shoes. We don't say the shoes of the boy. And today's newspaper, not the newspaper of today, but the of form is still very prevalent. Did this change take place because of the French? Well, we cannot be certain. And there are a lot of changes that take place in English grammar that mirror French grammar. And it's probably not all coincidence, but to what extent, we're not sure. Again, have a look at my groundbreaking video on the influence of French on the English language for more on that. Here's a sentence from Middle English. It's in the introduction to the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. Befell that in that season on a day, in Southwark at the tabard as I lay, ready to wenden on me pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage. At night was come into that hostelry, where 29 in a company of sundry folk. What you'll notice from that piece is that there are a significant number of French words, which I've highlighted in red, all of which are still used today, albeit with different spellings. And it's not only the vocabulary, the grammar too is not so different from modern English. What throws you is the pronunciation. More on that in a moment. Thousands of French words entered the English language at that time. But what is significant about the loan words in this period is that they entered the language through speaking, not writing. Why is this? Well, firstly, most people were illiterate at that time. And even if they could read, there were no printed books. That didn't happen until the 1470s. And French was the language of prestige. Just like today, languages such as modern German, French and Japanese and Dutch and many others think it's cool to use English words, especially in the spoken language. And it was the same with French in the Middle English period. Using French words had a certain prestige, a certain cachet, even if you didn't actually speak French. Because French words entered the language through speaking, it explains why we have so many and so quickly. So, for example, think of the ways that we say that something is very good, excellent, fine, magnificent, grand, marvellous, quality, desirable, notable, beautiful. All these words are from French. Anyway, to sum up, in the Middle English period, the grammar was transformed. It shed most of the Anglo-Saxon complexities. Thousands of new words from French entered the language via spoken English. And not only that, it's estimated that only about 15% of Old English words are still used in modern English. Most are gone, vanished, kaput, either fell into disuse or were replaced by words of French or Latin origin. Old English had the word, for example, bookhouse, Bockhus, which was replaced by the French word library. Yetal was replaced by the French word number. So what huge cataclysmic event rocked the English language to its core and brought about the change from Middle English to Modern English? Yes, that's right. It was the great vowel shift, or as every hip linguist who's ever parsed a sentence calls it, the GVS.
As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice at it. As he was valiant, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him.
So while the change from Old English to Middle English was about grammar changes and spoken words, the transformation from Middle English to Modern English was brought about mostly by changes in pronunciation and the addition of vocabulary mainly from written English. The GVS were changes in the pronunciation of English long vowels that took place between roughly 1400 and 1600. There's a lot of disagreement about the exact time. So, for example, in Middle English, biete. In Modern English, bite. In Middle English, met. In Modern English, meet. In Middle English, met. In Modern English, meet. In Middle English, name. In Modern English, name. In Middle English, hus. In Modern English, house. In Middle English, bought. In Modern English, boot. And that's why it's so difficult to listen to a text of Middle English with Middle English pronunciation. So it's mostly, not entirely, but mostly about the pronunciation. By the way, if you've ever wondered why English spelling is so fucked up, it's partly because of the GVS. And William Caxton started printing books in English in 1473, and in that period most of the spelling got fixed. But the GVS wasn't over by then, so the pronunciation kept changing, but not the spelling. I made yet another mind-blowing video on the history of English spelling and why it's so weird. Check it out here. Now, what's interesting is that linguists have long speculated as to why the great vowel shift happened. Now, there are so many theories, but to me, the most plausible is that it was connected to the Black Death and the social upheaval it caused. And it's estimated that the plague wiped out somewhere between 40 and 60% of England's population. Peasants spoke differently from the aristocracy. The poor speak differently from the rich. They always have, and they still do, in England at least. And after the Black Death, there was a severe shortage of labour, and this led to greater upward mobility. Roles once reserved for the French-speaking ruling classes were now being filled by people from the lower ranks of society, and they brought their accents with them. And at the same time, people from the countryside flocked to the cities, especially London, bringing a mix of regional accents. And over time, the accent in London began to shift, and that shift was the GVS. And that also explains why the GVS affected the north of England less than it affected London and the south. The early modern period also overlaps with the Renaissance, and during this upheaval, a lot of words are entering the English language through writing, through literature, through science, the arts, philosophy, and through teaching at universities. Words flowed in from Latin, Greek, and once again French, but this time it's the French from Paris and not the Norman dialect. Let's just look at a few borrowed words from this period. Encyclopedia, democracy, satellite, incongruous, obvious, agenda, ambiguous. Those are from Latin and Greek. And then from French you get naive, ballet, lexicon, rendezvous, modern, facade, bourgeois, anxiety, to name but a few. We're almost there, but not quite. Why is Shakespeare so difficult to read when it's classified as modern English compared to, say, Jane Austen, writing 200 years later, which is relatively easy to read? And there are a number of reasons for this. And one is that many words have changed their meaning. So, for example, here's a story from the Great Fire of London, 1666. It destroyed most of the city, including the old St. Paul's Cathedral. The greatest architect of the day was commissioned to construct a replacement, Sir Christopher Wren. He did it, and it still stands to this day. It was completed in 1710, and reportedly, when Queen Anne saw it for the first time, she remarked that it was amusing, awful, and artificial. It sounds insulting, and yet Sir Christopher was reportedly delighted with her reaction. And the reason is that these words have changed their meaning. Amusing meant pleasing, awful meant awe-inspiring, and artificial meant skillfully made. So it was actually high praise. And here's another example from Shakespeare. See if you understand this. Now in Henry V, a character says, I kiss his dirty shoe, and from heartstring I love the lovely bully. What is thy name? Now, a bully isn't a violent thug. Well, not in Shakespeare's day, when a bully meant a fine fellow. And another thing that makes these older texts tricky is that some words just aren't used anymore. And here's another Shakespeare quote that I'm sure you know. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Now, art thou is archaic, but wherefore doesn't mean where, it means why. So a modern translation would be Romeo, Romeo, why are you Romeo? She asks, why are you a Montague and not a Capulet? And then many words go out of fashion and are replaced by synonyms or phrasal verbs. So, for example, in the King James Bible, we have this. I went by the field of the slothful and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. That's correct, even in modern English, but these days, slothful is rare and void of understanding seems strange to us. Today, we'd just say something like, I passed by the field of a lazy person and the vineyard of someone who lacked judgment. Or take the verb to chide. Now, it still exists, but it's much more common to say to tell off or to rebuke. And even though it's still sometimes used, I don't think I've ever heard the use of the past participle, chidden, even though it's in the dictionary. Once again, I have been chidden in the comments section for my spelling mistakes. But it was used by Shakespeare. A character in Julius Caesar says, all the rest look like a chidden train. A chidden train? What is that, like a rebuked locomotive? Well, train used to mean the followers or everyone else. It comes from the French traîner, meaning to drag along. In today's English, the sentence would read, everyone with him looked like they'd been told off. And that shift to phrasal verbs we see everywhere in today's English. I'd say, I got up at 8, not I rose at 8. I'd say, I turned in or I went to bed, and not I retired for the night. I handed over control rather than I relinquished control. And if you're interested in the history of the English language, then sign up for my newsletter, The Rambler. It's free. The link is in the description. Or support the channel and get exclusive content by becoming a Patreon. That's all for now. Fare thee well.